Hi everyone, welcome to this video on lesson 9 of the reproduction scheme of work. We've moved on from human reproduction to now studying plant reproduction in this lesson. And in a very similar way to how the first lesson, after we introduced the core concept of sexual reproduction and this idea that it all comes down to fertilization, that was in the kind of history of science case study lesson 1 of this scheme. Lesson 2 was on human reproductive systems. So it was, okay, if you now know that fertilization is the big idea that is going to combine all the ideas in this scheme together, now let's just look at the parts. And actually, in the section on plants, which is just 4 lessons at the end of this scheme, we do exactly the same thing. So students should, by this point, be pretty confident with the idea of fertilization. So the first thing that we're going to do is just name all of the parts of the flower in order that they can see how fertilization occurs in plants. But I think it's important, as I keep saying throughout this scheme of work, not to just go into kind of information transmission mode and just say, right, you need to remember this name and this name and this name and this name. It is really important that they remember the names, and that's the kind of thing we will do through retrieval going forward through later schemes of work. So that's really, really important that they remember the names. But what's kind of more important is that they can, I suppose, see how fertilization in plants is really analogous to fertilization in humans. Very, very similar process that's going on, albeit with some slight differences. So the first difference that we want to draw students' attention to is that unlike in animals and human beings are the ones we've studied, plants have both male and female reproductive systems within the same plant. And that's really, really important. So we can, again, and I'm not going to go into all the labeling because it's probably better to do that on PowerPoint or with slides or worksheets or whatever. So naming things is something that the visualizer might not be the best tool for. But what I am going to do is say, okay, these are the male parts of the plant, and these produce the male sex cells for the plants. But what we want to emphasize is that whereas in human beings, the male sex cells are sperms, in plants, the male sex cells are pollen. So I'm going to draw some orange dots, or I might do yellow dots as well. And again, ask them whether they've ever seen a plant. Get a flower out and show them the pollen on the flower, especially if you're teaching this in the summer term. Hopefully you'll be able to see some. Because what they should see is that the male parts of a plant, at the top, the anthers have pollen at the top. Now, what the image we want to get across to students is that for fertilization to occur, we need to get pollen from one flower over to the female reproductive part, the carpel, of a different flower. So essentially, somehow, for fertilization to occur, we need to get some of this orange stuff from the anthers over here, or to the stamen, over to the stigma of a different plant. And this is where in the next lesson we're going to look at pollination. How do we do that? And again, students are only going to understand all of that stuff about pollination if they see how it relates to this bigger idea of fertilization. But essentially, this is the diagram that's going to help them make sense of everything that they study in the subsequent 3 lessons after this one. And it's not just naming the parts, it's knowing how the parts help the plant carry out fertilization. I don't think there's too much more to say than that. I suppose that the final thing to say is, yeah, it's going to be really helpful to make analogies between human reproduction, which is obviously a lot more concrete. Students are really, really familiar with the parts of the human body, and hopefully after having 8 lessons on it, they'll be pretty familiar with how those parts interact to reproduce a human and make a new organism. It's going to be useful to make analogies between the plant case and the human case, without, I suppose, stretching those analogies too far. But if you want to think about, these being like the sperm cells and this being like the vagina and uterus and so on, that might be helpful just to get students to think about it. I suppose what's important is that they recognise that there are some subtle differences as well. But that's I think how I would go about introducing plant reproduction, rather than just naming the parts and moving on. It all comes back to our big idea of fertilisation. And once students are clear on that, then they'll be ready for the next lesson, which we'll cover, and that's going to be on pollination. How do we get pollen from the stamen of one plant to the carpel of another plant? And obviously, as we will see, it's either through insects or through the wind.